Welcome to Kali Tribune podcast. In this episode, I will provide an answer to a question by one of our readers that is seemingly very simple. He asks, what is ontology? Now, this word that is today understood as denoting a philosophical so-called discipline, among other philosophical disciplines, is very commonly used, and I'm sure that you listening to me already have some implied understanding of what it means. And I would recommend maybe pausing for a second and trying to figure out what this meaning that you maybe figured out for yourself is. In the following, I'll try to show that this is not really a simple question, or better to say, question is simple, but answer is by no means simple, because implications of ontology take us very deep in the very nature of philosophy and the difference between contemporary or modern philosophy and traditional metaphysics. Namely, ontology is not an expression that's been with us for a long time now. It was first used as to denote a proverbial philosophical discipline was in 18th century, and it was used by famous, at his time at least, an influential German philosopher Christian Wolff, who was a philosophical follower of the teachings of Leibniz. The reason why Wolff introduced this word to denote a special philosophical discipline is because he was intent to build a system of philosophical sciences. In this system, what was originally in Middle Ages understood as metaphysics was separated into various disciplines. The first division of metaphysics for Christian Wolff was division between metaphysica generalis and metaphysica specialis, where metaphysica specialis is further divided into science of God, theology, science of soul, that is to say rational psychology, and the science of the world as a whole, that is to say rational or metaphysical cosmology. Metaphysica generalis, on the other hand, is synonymous with ontology. Now, this is very important. First of all, when we today talk about Aristotle's ontology or Thomas Aquinas' ontology, we are implying, at least by words in themselves, that Thomas and Aristotle had ontology in some variation of the senses that Christian Wolff defined it. That is to say, as a philosophical discipline among other disciplines in the system of science. This is not true. This is, in fact, the opposite of truth. But we'll get back to that. Namely, ontology, in the modern sense of the word, is a science or philosophical discipline that inquires about being as such. Being, that is to say, not in the sense of any given, as moderns like to say, set of beings, that is to say, not beings insofar as they are numbers, not beings insofar as they are beings of nature, substances or entities in nature, physical beings, not in the sense even the beings are the psychological phenomena called beings. Ontology is the discipline that inquires into each and every one of them only insofar as they are. The implication here is, of course, that every being has, or no matter how different it is, no matter what different set of beings it belongs to, or set of entities, has this in common, that it is. This is ontology. In this sense, ontology in the modern age and postmodern age is sharply distinguished from metaphysics. Because today on university you can have a collegium or a subject taught by professor that is called ontology, or ontology of this, ontology of that. But you won't find metaphysics, at least not in the secular universities. The reason for this is that metaphysics implies the existence of the causes and principles that are first, causes and principles of the being in general. That would mean that if we pair up ontology and metaphysics, if we would to join them into one science, as was originally the case, this ontological metaphysics, let's call it like that for a second, would be inquiry of being in a universal sense, being insofar it is a being, and its causes and principles. No such thing is endeavored today. And the reasons are very important. And this is what gives a depth to our discussion on this rather simple question. To get back to Christian Wolff. Christian Wolff's importance for contemporary philosophy and history of philosophy in general is mostly that he provided a blueprint for the structure of Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason, or critique of pure mind. Because insofar as Kant's critique is a critique of metaphysics, by which Kant means attempt to ascertain can metaphysics be a science, as such blueprint, it gives form to all the to chapters in the Kant's book. And chapters mirror the activity of the reflection of the pure mind in itself. So, when Kant talks about metaphysics, to be more precise, when he talks about what he calls dogmaticism, that is to say, philosophy that ascertains that there are some supersensual or supernatural principles that be inquired, he mostly means in terms of Leibniz Wolffian philosophy. It's called Leibniz Wolffian because, as I said, Wolff was expounder of Leibniz's philosophy, and Wolff's philosophy was kind of an attempt to create or develop a form of Protestant scholasticism. Now, Kant's critique mostly, when Kant talks about critique of Plato or critique of Aristotle, but mostly of Plato, in what he thinks, in fact, is more like critique of Leibniz, because this is how metaphysics, in this sense in which he believed that it is not really a proper form for it, was mediated to him. So when Kant speaks, for instance, about so-called antinomies of pure reason, where he tries to prove that whether you ascertain that the world has beginning in time or doesn't have a beginning in time, it all amounts to the same because both propositions can be proven true. He is in fact perusing cosmology or one form of metaphysica specialis provided by Christian Wolff. At least he's using the form of this separation and diversification of philosophical sciences that Wolff proposed. Now, why is this important? It is important because what we call ontology today, as I said, was metaphysics day before yesterday. And before it was called metaphysics, it was called first philosophy or wisdom by Aristotle. And I would even venture to say that Plato had it in far more congenial way to Aristotle than most people think. But that's subject in itself, of course. I'll just put that as a remark for you to think about it if you're interested. The origin of the question of being, in the sense that being is inquired upon as being insofar it is a being, comes from Aristotle's metaphysics. And as I said at the outset, this question was posed, to be more precise, in books Gamma and Epsilon of Aristotle's Metaphysics. So let us paraphrase Aristotle himself from the beginning of the Gamma book of Metaphysics. So he says, there has to be a science that inquires into being insofar it is being, in Greek on, and all things that pertain to it in itself. Because every other science divides or separates specific genera of being, but no other special science investigates being insofar it is being. That is to say, being that transcends the genera. So let us unpack this definition as quickly as we can. The very important is this word that I translated as things pertaining to it in itself. Greek word is hyparchontas. One could call them dependencies. Things that are proper to being insofar it is being. Not being insofar it is some particular genera of being. Genera of being are, for instance, let's say animals, or let's say material things, or angels, if we want to put it that way, to lift it up a notch. Being insofar it is being takes into its focus what is common to everything, in fact. And what is very interesting and very important to understand, this common being, ens universalis, or on, is something that exists. It's not a concept. It's not something that you gain through investigations of all beings in general, and you make some kind of intellectual act that somehow creates this being as being. This is not the case in ancient and later medieval philosophy. This is a modern approach. Now, when we say that this is science, if we want to follow Aristotle, it has nothing to do with philosophical science as Christian Wolff understood it, or his critic Immanuel Kant, and even later one who was also dependent in some extent to this understanding, modern understanding of philosophical science, Hegel. There is nothing of a sort in Aristotle. Now, I'll just point out this genera of particular beings. On is not a generic term. It's very important to understand. Being, in the sense of on in Greek, or ens in Latin, transcends genera, because genera is differentiated, that is to say, given its active form, its reality, in fact, by species. And this comes from outside of the genera itself. For instance, man is the living being or living animal endowed with intellect, or even language. So zone, logon, ehon in Greek. Now, zone is genera, animal is genera, being endowed with intellect is differentia. It's what contracts this genera in the species of man. There is nothing in animal that is actually intellect. But bear in mind, this does not mean that man is somehow composed from animal and intellectual immaterial nature, which is what this in fact means. No. Man is as a whole an animal, but only in implicit sense. That is to say, man has all the potentialities of animal, but only those are actual that are informed by his intellectual nature. And this differentiates him from all the other animals. And this is very important to understand, because today this relationship is not really understood like that. This certain reality of possibilities and potencies. This would mean, just to say in passing, that every man has potentialities of woman in himself, and vice versa. Those potentialities cannot be actualized because he is man. His form, eidos or forma in Latin, that is to say, the actual existence of him, not actual, let's say principle of actual existence, because matter is here being understood as potency, or potency as matter, although potency is a far wider term, because potency pertains to being, not only as being as material being, will never be actualized. And they will never be actualized because the form that really informs every human being is the soul. This is the principle of action, the act of body, as they would say traditionally, not in the sense of genitivus, declension, in the sense that somehow body produces soul, but vice versa. Soul is in natural order prior to body, because it gives it unity above all other things, and it gives it unity in a specific, in a human case, personal way. But it's very important that it is not why I'm saying this, because although it's not the subject of this podcast, it's ever-present subject of the debates in the West, namely that biology defines man and woman. No, it doesn't. Metaphysics defines man and woman. That is to say, to be more precise, a metaphysical entity that is to some extent investigated by metaphysics or physics, physica, but understood in a traditional way, not in a modern way. That is to say, soul and intellect. But that's, of course, a story in itself. So let's go further. What are these dependencies of being as being? And being is not genera. It's wider, not even more general than genera, but universal. No difference can come into being. You cannot say, for instance, that being is differentiated in species, because the only thing that is opposite to being is non-being. And where there is non-being, must I make a conclusion myself? There is no being. It's very important to understand these are not just logical games as people today think. But I won't belabor the point because it's not a subject here. So let us move forward. So this is the specific kind of knowledge. This knowledge of metaphysics of first philosophy is analysis in original sense, which means drawing the effect, the implication, finding the presence of the cause in the effect, drawing oneself and one's own mind towards the cause by following the traces of the cause in the effect. And being in general points, universal being, the ever-presence of being, implies something that is beyond being, in fact. And Aristotle posed generations of his interprets in modern age, at least, with a dilemma, because on the one hand, he claims that we have a science of universal being, but on the other hand, he would say, he said in the same breath, that it is also theology, but theology investigates primarily one unique cause and principle of all, that is God. So how can something be both universal and one specific, as he says, ousia, substance, immaterial, completely actual substance, in fact pure energeia, pure energy, in a specific sense of the word energy, not in the New Age sense, mind you. Now, for him, this was not dilemma. For his interprets, Platonic, especially Neoplatonists, it was no dilemma. And I think that we can best understood what is meant by this when we introduce the third thinker from the third period, that is to say, not antiquity, not modernity, but Middle Ages, who gave form to what we now call ontology, and he called it metaphysics, in contrast to Aristotle, and that's Thomas Aquinas. And I'm referring here to his interpretation of Boethius, Severin Boethius, a Latin, very important Latin thinker, De Trinitate. And this little book, that is commentary, has a hefty last, let's say, chapter that is devoted to explaining what metaphysics is and differentiating metaphysics from theology, which is very, very important in Christianity. It is my opinion that Christianity really managed to fulfill the philosophy of antiquity. Not that philosophy of antiquity was partial or contradictory as in itself as something, but it gave it a kind of resolution. So, not to belabor that point also, what does Thomas claim? Well, it's simple. For Thomas, the subject of metaphysics is ens universalis, same as Aristotle would say. But we have to understand the difference in language usage between us and Thomas, because we would say probably that not that being as being, if it is what is inquired by this science is subject, we would say it is object, but it is not. First of all, as I always repeat, for thinkers like Aquinas and Aristotle, division between subject and object in the modern sense does not exist. It is an existent problem. And people who see this, think in this discrepancy, when they start to interpret them, read into their philosophy something that was never there. And for my mind, it was quite better for them that it wasn't there. Object and subject have different meaning. Object, for Thomas Aquinas, is the medium of knowledge. So, to give you an example, light is the object of sight. Now, this means that if I am now looking at a microphone to which I'm speaking, microphone is not object of my vision, but luminous air through which I see it, because everything that is seen requires light. Very similarly, the subject of metaphysics, which is universal being, has to be looked upon through principles of metaphysics, which are first principles and causes. That is to say, God and his acts, angels, so on. It's a long story, let's say, but ultimately God. However, God is subject to nothing, and consequently, God is not subject of metaphysics, although he is present in it. And this is something that is really easy simple to understand, but not easy. And this is, I mean, the book I'm talking about, the passages I'm talking about in Thomas are painstakingly detailed, and very, very simple, very concise and clear, but they give you so much food for thought that sometimes you feel really oversaturated with it. Now, what this means? This means that everything that is known in metaphysics is known in a certain medium, I would say. And this medium is the light that is provided by these principles. This light is being. And Thomas very often uses the word light in what in fact is really not metaphoric sense. And this is something that would require also a podcast and or essay in itself, this understanding of metaphor, because he really takes the point that intelligible light, which is the light that is perceivable to intellect, is origin of the physical light, or better to say, origin of the, let's say, usage of the metaphor of light in everything else, as if light participates in intelligible light in some sense, but this would take us, of course, too far. So metaphysics requires the presence of something that is unknown in itself, that is known only as present, not in the sense that you understand what it is. So everything is understood in the light of, in fact, creation. Because the ens universalis, that is the proper subject of metaphysics, is the fact that everything that is that we humans, the human mind can comprehend, or even superhuman mind of angels, which is very important in Middle Ages, is a creature. The first creation, the first and elementary form of creation is being. Therefore, not being as some kind of quantifiable being or some different genera of being, but being as being is created. And you understand it as created in metaphysics because it points out to its cause, to its origin, which is God. So from metaphysics, you really can become aware of the existence of God. Of course, this word existence, something that is, well, not really well translated from Latin esse, is also something that we more properly translate as being. This is infinitive of the verb to be, but it's not being in the sense of ens, it is being in the sense of the so-called act of being. And this opens a whole lot of depth that I cannot go into now. I'm very much simplifying things here, but this is more or less, for the sakes of this podcast, explanation of how Middle Ages in its proper form, as I would claim in High Middle Ages of Thomas Aquinas or Albert the Great, and such thinkers, even Eckhart, understood this. So we have three notions. We have ontology of Christian Wolff, we have first philosophy of Aristotle, and we have metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas. In both three senses concern being as being, but as I think you already noticed, have a radical different, radical different content of what they considered being to be. Because what Christian Wolff considers to be this ens universalis has very little to do, save in words, what Thomas considers or what Aristotle considers to be being. So ontology, to conclude, ontology is a modern term. Ontology presupposes subject-object split, it presupposes modern science at its inception, and the scientific way of thinking, of understanding causes, of the primacy of laws of nature over causes, and such things, of theodicy, for instance, instead of theology, and a lot of other things, but above all, of science understood as this methodical subject-object split, and an attempt that you from subject somehow reach the object. And then you have these separations of sciences into specific systematic disciplines. There are no systems in Aristotle and Thomas, and I will conclude just saying why. Because the subject transcends the inquirer. You who are inquiring into being as being are, in a sense, a derivative of it. You are part of it. So, whereas the cause of being as being, of ens universalis, transcends all. It is uncreated cause. So you cannot have limited knowledge, which system is, of unlimited. And in systems, the problem is that systems, when you introduce them into metaphysics, tend to make what is finite to make it absolute, because system, by its very nature, requires totality, circumscribing to the totality and coming to some kind of absolute knowledge. And that's something that happened not long after Christian Wolff with Hegel, and later the others. I already spoke and wrote about it, but now we have to close this podcast. I believe that this was exhaustive enough and that I properly answer your question. Thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malic of Kali Tribune signing out.